Millions of people spend every single spring on their knees in the grass, digging, spraying, cursing, trying to kill this plant, without ever realizing that the very thing they are trying to destroy has been eaten, brewed, and prescribed as medicine for thousands of years across nearly every continent on Earth. It grows in cracks in the sidewalk. It grows in manicured golf courses. It grows in the Himalayas and in Siberian tundra and in the middle of Manhattan. And yet almost nobody stops to ask a simple question. How did this one small yellow flower become one of the most successful, most resilient, and quite possibly one of the most medicinally significant plants on the planet? Today, we're going to find out. We're going to look closely, really closely, at something so common that most of us have stopped seeing it at all. And by the end, you may never look at your lawn the same way again. Its name is Taraxacum officinale. Say it slowly, and it almost sounds like a spell, which feels appropriate because for most of human history, that's more or less how people treated it. The word Taraxacum is thought to come from Persian and Greek roots connected to bitterness and disorder, a nod to its intensely bitter taste and its supposed ability to fix disorders of the body. The second word, officinale, is a term that shows up again and again in Old Botanical Latin, and it always means the same thing. This plant was official. It was stocked in the officina, the storeroom of a medieval monastery or apothecary, right alongside the other plants considered essential medicine. In other words, the very scientific name of the dandelion is a fossil of its own history, a name that quietly tells you it once sat on the same shelf as the most trusted remedies known to European medicine. Botanically, the dandelion belongs to the Asteraceae family, sometimes called the daisy family or the sunflower family, one of the largest and most successful plant families on Earth. This is the same family that gives us sunflowers, chamomile, chicory, artichokes, and lettuce. If you've ever looked closely at a sunflower and noticed that what looks like one giant flower is actually made up of hundreds of tiny flowers packed together, you already understand something important about the dandelion, because the same trick is happening on a smaller scale in every single dandelion head. That bright yellow flower you see is not one flower at all. It is a composite of anywhere from 150 to over 200 individual tiny flowers, called florets, each one capable of producing its own seed. This is one of the great secrets of the dandelion's success. It isn't fighting to survive as a single blossom. It's operating like a small, self-sufficient colony, hundreds of miniature factories working together under one golden roof. Originally, the dandelion is believed to have evolved somewhere across Europe and Asia, likely in the temperate grasslands and open meadows of Eurasia, where a plant that could bloom early, feed early pollinators, and disperse seeds on the wind would have had a serious evolutionary advantage. But originally is really the key word, because dandelions did not stay put. Human trade routes, ships, wagons, boots, and eventually the deliberate choices of settlers carried dandelion seeds across oceans. European colonists brought it to North America on purpose, not by accident, because they valued it as food and medicine, and once it arrived, it thrived so effectively that most Americans today assume it's a native species. It isn't. It's an immigrant that made itself completely at home. Today, you can find dandelions on every continent except Antarctica, from sea-level city parks to alpine meadows above 10,000 feet. Few plants on Earth have achieved that kind of range. So why did it succeed so spectacularly, where countless other plants struggle just to survive in one small region? Part of the answer lies in a reproductive trick that sounds almost like science fiction. Many dandelions reproduce through a process called apomixis, which means they can produce seeds that are genetically identical to the parent plant without needing pollination at all. Essentially, a dandelion can clone itself. It doesn't need a partner. It doesn't need perfect weather for pollinators to show up. And it doesn't need genetic mixing to guarantee its future generation will be just as tough and adaptable as it is. Add to that its taproot, which can drive down more than 10 feet into soil searching for water and minerals other shallow-rooted plants can't reach. And you start to understand why lawns full of weaker grass are the ones constantly losing this battle. Now let's talk about that seed head, because it deserves its own moment. After the yellow flower fades, it transforms into that perfect, ghostly sphere we all recognize, the one almost everyone has blown on as a child, making a wish, watching hundreds of tiny parachutes drift into the wind. Scientists actually studied this seed structure in detail and discovered something remarkable. Each little parachute, called a pappus, creates a unique kind of air vortex above it as it falls, a separated air bubble that forms and detaches over and over, keeping the seed aloft far longer and more efficiently than physics would predict from its shape alone. In other words, that childhood wish-making toy is actually one of the most aerodynamically refined seed dispersal structures in the entire plant kingdom. A single dandelion plant can produce over 200 seeds, and a single gust of wind can carry them for miles. Multiply that by millions of plants blooming across a single county every spring, and the picture becomes clear. This isn't an accident of nature. This is one of evolution's most efficient distribution systems, hiding in plain sight in your backyard. Let's step back now and travel through time, because the story of the dandelion is really the story of human beings quietly relying on this plant for far longer than most of us have been taught. In ancient Greece, physicians working in the tradition of Hippocrates and later Dioscorides documented plants from the same family as dandelion for treating liver ailments and digestive complaints. Dioscorides, whose work De Materia Medica became one of the most influential pharmacological texts in history, described related bitter herbs used to stimulate what we would now call digestive bile flow. The Greeks understood, long before biochemistry existed, that bitterness in a plant often correlated with an effect on digestion, and dandelion's intensely bitter leaf would have fit naturally into that framework. Move forward to the Roman Empire, and you find a culture that prized bitter greens as both food and tonic. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder catalogued hundreds of plants in his sprawling Natural History, and while dandelion by its modern name doesn't appear cleanly labelled the way it would be centuries later, the broader category of bitter, milky-sapped herbs used for liver and stomach complaints was well established in Roman herbal practice. Bitter herbs before a meal were considered an appetite stimulant, a tradition that, remarkably, still echoes today in the modern popularity of bitters in cocktails and aperitifs. Then we arrive in the medieval world, and here the documentation becomes much clearer. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Arab physicians, including the renowned Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, were writing detailed descriptions of a plant they called Taraxacum, describing its use for liver and spleen ailments. This is actually one of the earliest clear written records we have of the plant, under a name closely resembling its modern scientific title. From the Islamic Golden Age's medical scholarship, knowledge of the plant filtered into European monastic medicine, where monks maintained herb gardens attached to their infirmaries and carefully copied medical texts by hand. It was in these monastery gardens and in the hands of these monk physicians that dandelion earned its permanent place in the European pharmacopoeia, eventually cementing that word officinale into its very name. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, an entirely separate herbal tradition had already been using dandelion, or closely related Taraxacum species native to Asia, for well over 1,000 years. In traditional Chinese medicine, dandelion is known as pugong ying, and it appears in classical Chinese medical texts dating back centuries, where it's categorized as a heat-clearing, detoxifying herb. Traditional Chinese medicine practitioners used it especially for what they described as inflammatory conditions, skin infections, and breast-related complaints in nursing mothers, often prepared as a decoction or applied topically as a poultice. It's a striking piece of history. Two civilizations separated by mountains, deserts, and thousands of miles independently arrived at using the same plant family for remarkably similar purposes: supporting the liver, clearing what they perceived as internal heat or toxicity, and treating inflammation. Across the Atlantic, long before European ships ever reached North American shores, indigenous peoples were already engaging with native Taraxacum species and other closely related bitter plants in their own herbal systems, using roots and leaves for digestive troubles and as a general spring tonic after long winters low in fresh greens. Once the European dandelion arrived with settlers, several Native American communities incorporated it readily into their own medicinal practices, using root decoctions for kidney and liver support, a use that dovetailed naturally with existing knowledge of similar native plants. By the time we reach European herbal tradition of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, dandelion had become an absolute staple. English herbalist Nicholas Culpeper, in his hugely influential 1652 work, described dandelion extensively, recommending it for the liver, kidneys, and what were then called obstructions of the internal organs. This period is also when dandelion picked up one of its strangest and most memorable folk names. In French, it's called pissenlit, which translates bluntly to wet the bed, a name so direct it leaves nothing to the imagination. This nickname exists because of the plant's well-documented diuretic effect, its ability to increase urine production, an effect so noticeable and consistent that generations of European children were literally warned not to pick too many dandelions or they'd wet the bed that night. In English-speaking folk tradition, the plant carried a nearly identical nickname for the exact same reason. Folklore surrounding dandelion goes far beyond bedwetting jokes, though. In parts of European tradition, blowing the seed head and counting the remaining seeds was believed to tell you the hour of the day. Blow once, and if seeds remain, blow again. And whatever number of blows it took to clear the head supposedly told you how many years until your wish came true, or in some traditions, how many children you'd someday have. In Victorian flower symbolism, an entire vocabulary where flowers were assigned emotional meanings, the dandelion came to represent faithfulness, healing, and, fittingly, the passage of time itself. A symbolism drawn directly from watching that seed head scatter to the wind. Now, let's get practical, because if you're going to understand this plant fully, you need to know how to actually recognize one in the wild with total confidence, because there are lookalikes and a few genuinely important mistakes beginners can make. Start with the leaves. True dandelion leaves grow directly from the base of the plant in what's called a basal rosette. There is no branching stem holding the leaves up high. The leaves themselves are deeply toothed along the edges, with jagged points that historically inspired the plant's common English name. Dandelion comes from the French dent de lion, meaning lion's tooth, a reference to those sharp, backward-pointing serrations along the leaf margin. The leaves are smooth, hairless, and shiny rather than fuzzy. And when you snap a leaf or stem, It releases a distinctive, milky white sap. That milky sap is actually one of your best identification tools because true dandelions always produce it, from the leaf, the flower stem, and the root, without exception. The flower itself grows on a single hollow stem, without leaves branching off it, topped by one flower head only, never multiple flowers branching from a single stalk. The colour is a bright, saturated yellow, and if you look closely, every single petal you see is actually its own miniature flower, a ray flore, each with 5 tiny fused teeth at its tip. If you examine it up close, a leftover trace of its 5 original petals fused together. The root is a long, unbranched taproot, tan to brown on the outside, white on the inside, and again, full of that characteristic bitter milky sap. And of course, after flowering, you get that unmistakable spherical seed head, a perfect white orb of parachuted seeds. As for seasonal changes, dandelions are among the very first flowers to bloom in early spring, often appearing while snow is still melting in colder climates, which is exactly why early pollinators depend on them so heavily. They'll continue blooming in flushes through summer and often again in autumn, and in mild climates, you can find a stray dandelion blooming even in winter. Now, the lookalikes. The most common one people confuse with dandelion is called cat's ear, or Hippocaris radicata, sometimes called false dandelion. The key difference is, cat's ear has hairy, less deeply lobed leaves, and its flower stems are often branched with small scales along them, unlike dandelion's smooth, single, hollow, leafless stem. Another lookalike is sow thistle, which has spiny, prickly leaf edges that clasp the stem, quite different from dandelion's smooth basal rosette. Hawkweed is another common one, distinguished by hairy leaves and stems and often multiple flower heads per stem. The simplest, most reliable rule for a beginner: check for the single leafless hollow flower stem, the milky sap, and the basal rosette of jagged leaves with no branching. If all 3 are present, you are almost certainly looking at a true dandelion. None of the common lookalikes are dangerously toxic, which is reassuring, but true dandelion remains the most extensively documented and safest choice for both food and traditional preparations. Now that you can identify it with confidence, let's talk about actually eating it, because nearly every part of this plant is edible, and each part offers something different. The flowers are mildly sweet with a subtle honey-like note, especially if picked when freshly opened in the morning. They're often used whole in fritters, infused into syrups, or steeped to flavor honey and wine. The leaves are the most bitter part of the plant, especially as the season progresses and the plant matures. Young spring leaves, harvested before the plant flowers, are noticeably milder and are the preferred choice for fresh salads. As the season goes on, the bitterness intensifies, which is when cooks typically switch to sautéing, braising, or blanching the leaves to mellow that sharp edge, similar to how you might cook down other bitter greens like escarole or chicory. The root is the part most associated with traditional tonics. Fresh, it has an earthy, slightly bitter flavor, but when roasted until deeply browned, it develops a rich, nutty, almost cocoa-like character, which is precisely why roasted dandelion root has become a popular caffeine-free coffee substitute. The unopened flower buds, picked while still tightly closed and green, are sometimes compared to capers once pickled in vinegar brine, offering a briny, tangy little bite. And the seeds themselves, while not typically eaten by humans in any significant culinary tradition, are, as we discussed, an enormously important food source for birds and other wildlife. Nutritionally, dandelion greens are genuinely impressive. They're notably rich in vitamin K, vitamin A in the form of beta-carotene, and vitamin C. They also provide meaningful amounts of calcium, potassium, and iron, along with a good dose of dietary fiber, particularly a specific type called inulin, which is especially concentrated in the root. Inulin is what's known as a prebiotic fiber, meaning it isn't digested by our own bodies, but instead travels down to feed the beneficial bacteria living in our gut. The leaves and flowers are also rich sources of polyphenols and flavonoids, plant compounds known for their antioxidant activity, meaning they help neutralize unstable molecules called free radicals that can otherwise contribute to cellular stress over time. The bitter compounds themselves, called sesquiterpene lactones, are part of what gives dandelion its characteristic taste. And they're also the compounds researchers believe may be responsible for some of its traditional digestive effects. Now let's move into the heart of this story, the part that likely explains why this plant survived so many centuries of human use in the first place: the science. It's important, right from the start, to draw a clear, honest line here. Traditional use across multiple civilizations for thousands of years tells us this plant was valued and widely trusted. But traditional use alone is not the same as modern clinical proof. Good science communication means being honest about that gap, so let's walk through what we actually know, carefully separating traditional belief, laboratory research, animal studies, and human clinical evidence. Digestive support is probably the single most consistent theme across every tradition we've discussed, from ancient Greece to traditional Chinese medicine to European folk practice. The proposed mechanism is fairly straightforward. The bitter compounds in dandelion are thought to stimulate the taste receptors that trigger digestive secretions, including bile flow from the liver and gallbladder. Some small human studies and a body of animal research have measured increased bile secretion after dandelion extract administration, lending some scientific support to this very old traditional claim. Still, the number of rigorous, large-scale human clinical trials remains limited, so while researchers describe dandelion as traditionally used to support healthy digestion and early evidence is promising, it hasn't reached the level of a definitively proven medical treatment. Liver health is closely connected to that same story. Dandelion root has traditionally been used across multiple cultures, specifically as a liver tonic. Laboratory studies using liver cells and animal studies using rodent models have shown that dandelion extracts may help reduce markers of oxidative stress in liver tissue and may support the liver's natural detoxification processes. Some research has explored dandelion's antioxidant compounds in the context of protecting liver cells from chemically induced damage in animal models, with encouraging results. However, human clinical trials specifically testing dandelion for liver disease remain scarce. So while the traditional reputation is centuries deep and the early laboratory science is genuinely interesting, robust human clinical proof is still an area of ongoing research rather than settled fact. Kidney function is another area with a long traditional history, particularly in European folk medicine, where dandelion's diuretic reputation, remember that French nickname, made it a go-to plant for supporting healthy fluid balance and flushing the urinary system. A small number of human studies have measured increased urine output after dandelion leaf extract, supporting that centuries-old observation with modern data. But again, we're talking about a handful of small studies, not the large-scale clinical trials needed to make firm medical claims about kidney disease treatment. Inflammation and antioxidant activity represent one of the most actively researched areas in current dandelion science. laboratory studies examining dandelion extracts in cell cultures have repeatedly identified anti-inflammatory and antioxidant activity, largely attributed to its rich content of polyphenols and flavonoids. Some animal studies have extended these findings, showing reduced markers of inflammation after dandelion extract administration in various inflammatory models. This is a genuinely exciting and active area of modern phytochemistry research, though it remains, for now, mostly at the laboratory and animal study stage rather than large confirmed human trials. Blood sugar regulation has become a growing area of scientific curiosity in just the past couple decades. Some animal studies have suggested that dandelion extracts may help improve insulin sensitivity and reduce blood glucose levels in diabetic rodent models, potentially connected to the plant's chicoraic acid and chlorogenic acid content, compounds also found in coffee and artichokes. Preliminary human research exists but remains limited in scale, so scientists describe this as an area where early research suggests potential, while emphasizing that it is absolutely not a substitute for prescribed diabetes management. Heart health research on dandelion is comparatively newer and smaller in volume. Some laboratory and animal studies have examined dandelion's potential effects on cholesterol metabolism and blood pressure regulation, with some encouraging early findings related to its potassium content and its antioxidant profile. This remains a preliminary area of study, with far more research needed before any confident statements about cardiovascular benefits could be made. Immune system research has focused largely on dandelion's polysaccharide content, complex sugar molecules that, in laboratory studies, have shown some immune-modulating activity in cell models. This research is still in fairly early stages. Skin health has an interesting dual history. Topically, dandelion sap has traditionally been applied to skin irritations and minor infections in multiple folk traditions, and some laboratory studies have identified antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties in dandelion extracts that could plausibly support that traditional use, though rigorous clinical testing on human skin conditions remains limited. Bone health research is genuinely still in its infancy for this specific plant, with a small number of laboratory studies exploring dandelion's mineral content, particularly calcium, in relation to bone cell activity, though this is far from established. The gut microbiome angle circles back to that inulin fiber we discussed earlier, since inulin is a well-documented prebiotic across many plants, not just dandelion. Researchers reasonably suggest that dandelion roots' inulin content could contribute to feeding beneficial gut bacteria, an area of broader nutritional science that applies well beyond this one plant. And finally, weight management and general nutrition. Dandelion greens are low in calories and nutrient-dense, which supports their inclusion in a healthy diet in the same way that any nutrient-rich leafy green would, though there's no specific clinical evidence that dandelion itself causes weight loss on its own. So here's the honest summary a careful scientist would give you. Dandelion has an extraordinarily rich and consistent traditional reputation across multiple independent civilizations, and modern laboratory and animal research has identified several plausible biochemical mechanisms that could explain why. But large-scale, rigorous human clinical trials remain the missing piece across nearly every one of these categories. This is a plant being actively studied with real scientific interest and genuinely promising early findings. But the responsible conclusion, for now, is that dandelion may support several aspects of health and continues to be studied for many more, rather than that it definitively cures or treats any specific disease. Now let's shift into the kitchen. because dandelion's culinary life is just as rich as its medicinal one. Dandelion tea is one of the simplest preparations, made by steeping dried leaves or flowers in hot water, producing a light, slightly bitter, grassy infusion. Dandelion root coffee, on the other hand, is a completely different experience. The roasted, ground root is brewed much like coffee grounds, producing a deep, brown, caffeine-free beverage with a surprisingly rich, toasty, almost chocolatey flavor that has made it a genuinely popular coffee alternative in health food circles for decades. Fresh dandelion salads use the young spring leaves, often paired with something acidic like a vinaigrette, or classically wilted with warm bacon fat and a splash of vinegar in traditional Southern and European preparations, a method that beautifully balances the leaf's natural bitterness. Dandelion soup appears in multiple European folk traditions, often a simple potato-based broth studded with the chopped greens. Dandelion pesto swaps traditional basil for the peppery green leaves, blended with garlic, olive oil, nuts, and parmesan for a bitter, herbaceous twist on the classic sauce. Dandelion flower honey infusion is made by steeping fresh blossoms in warm honey, producing a golden, faintly floral sweetener. Dandelion syrup, sometimes called poor man's honey, in older European households, is made by boiling the flowers down with sugar and lemon into a thick amber syrup, once used as an affordable honey substitute. Dandelion jelly follows a similar process, using the floral-infused liquid set with pectin into a delicate pale yellow spread. Fermented dandelion preparations exist too, most notably dandelion wine, a rustic country wine tradition found across England, Appalachia, and parts of Europe, made by fermenting the sugared floral infusion with yeast. Pickled dandelion buds, as we mentioned, offer a caper-like tang when brined in vinegar. And in modern healthy eating circles, dandelion greens are increasingly blended straight into green smoothies alongside spinach or kale for an extra nutritional boost. Traditional Asian preparations often center on the root and leaf in medicinal decoctions and soups within traditional Chinese medicine practice, sometimes combined with other herbs for targeted formulas, while traditional European preparations lean more heavily into the flour-based syrups, wines, and honey infusions we just described. Now, safety, because responsible information means being honest about who should be cautious. Allergic reactions are possible, particularly in people who are already sensitive to other members of the Asteraceae family, which includes ragweed, chrysanthemums, marigolds, and daisies. If you know you have a ragweed allergy, caution and a conversation with a doctor before consuming dandelion is genuinely wise. Medication interactions are a real consideration. Because dandelion has a documented diuretic effect, it could potentially interact with prescribed diuretic medications, amplifying their effect. Its influence on bile flow means it could also interact with certain medications processed through the liver, and there's some evidence it could interact with blood-thinning medications and certain diabetes medications, given its potential effects on blood sugar. Anyone on prescription medication should absolutely speak with a doctor or pharmacist before adding significant amounts of dandelion to their diet or trying any concentrated supplement or extract. Pregnancy is an area where caution is generally advised, not because of strong evidence of harm, but simply because rigorous safety research in pregnant populations is limited, and the standard, responsible medical guidance is to avoid concentrated herbal extracts during pregnancy unless specifically cleared by a doctor. People with existing kidney issues should be cautious as well, precisely because of that diuretic effect, since altering fluid and electrolyte balance could be more significant for someone with compromised kidney function. Similarly, people with gallbladder issues particularly gallstones or bile duct obstructions, are generally advised to avoid dandelion, since its traditional effect of stimulating bile flow could potentially worsen a blockage. In every one of these cases, the responsible message is the same. Dandelion has a long history of food use in modest culinary quantities, but if you're dealing with any of these health conditions or taking prescription medication, a conversation with a doctor before using it medicinally or in concentrated supplement form is simply the smart, careful choice. Let's zoom back out now to the bigger cultural and ecological picture, because there's something almost poetic about this plant's dual identity. Bees and other early pollinators depend heavily on dandelions, precisely because they bloom so early in spring, often before most other flowering plants have even opened, providing a crucial early food source when almost nothing else is available. Entomologists studying pollinator populations have specifically pointed to early blooming plants like dandelion as playing an outsized ecological role in supporting bee populations through that vulnerable early season gap. This creates a genuinely fascinating tension in modern suburban life. The exact same plant that lawn care companies spend billions of dollars trying to eliminate is quietly one of the most important early food sources keeping local pollinator populations alive. Some ecologists and conservationists have specifically pushed back against the cultural obsession with the perfectly uniform, dandelion-free lawn, pointing out that this obsession, largely a mid-20th century American cultural invention tied to suburban status symbolism, may be doing measurable harm to already struggling bee populations. Why are lawns so full of dandelions in the first place? Partly because our own behavior creates the perfect conditions for them. Regular mowing keeps competing taller plants and shrubs from establishing themselves, while dandelion's low-growing rosette shrugs off the mower blade completely unharmed. Its deep taproot lets it access water and nutrients far below where shallow grass roots can reach, giving it a serious advantage during dry spells when grass is struggling. In other words, the very lawn maintenance routine designed to keep a yard looking uniform is, ironically, one of the reasons dandelions thrive there so successfully. Climate plays its own role too. Milder winters and earlier springs, patterns increasingly documented in many temperate regions, tend to extend the dandelion's blooming window even further, something researchers studying shifting bloom times across various early flowering plants have specifically noted as a broader pattern connected to changing seasonal temperature patterns. As for modern scientific interest more broadly, dandelion has become a genuine subject of active laboratory research well beyond traditional medicine circles. Researchers have investigated its natural rubber-like latex content, since certain Taraxacum species produce a milky sap containing natural rubber compounds, an area of research explored specifically as a potential alternative, more sustainable rubber source compared to traditional rubber trees. Food scientists continue investigating its inulin fiber content in the context of functional food development. Phytochemists continue isolating and studying its specific polyphenol and flavonoid compounds in laboratory settings, trying to understand precisely which molecules are responsible for which biological effects. And agricultural researchers continue studying it, somewhat ironically, both as a persistent weed to be managed and as a potential future crop plant in its own right. So here we are, having travelled from ancient Greek physicians to Chinese medical scholars, from medieval monastery gardens to Native American herbal traditions, from Victorian flower folklore to modern laboratory phytochemistry, all following the story of one small yellow flower that most people mow down without a second thought. Maybe that's really the point of this whole story. We live in a world that constantly tells us significance has to look impressive, that healing has to come in a sleek bottle from a pharmacy, that value only exists in things that are rare or difficult to find. And yet, here is a plant that grows in sidewalk cracks, that pushes up through gravel, that most of us have spent our whole lives trying to eliminate from our yards. And it turns out to be one of the most quietly persistent threads running through human medicine and food across nearly every culture on Earth. It asks nothing of us. It doesn't need to be planted, watered, or protected. It simply shows up every single spring, offering itself freely, the way it has for thousands of years, to anyone patient enough to actually look down and notice it. Perhaps that's the real lesson hiding in that bright yellow bloom pushing up through the crack in your driveway. That some of the most extraordinary stories in nature don't begin in some remote rainforest or exotic mountain range. Sometimes they begin exactly where you're standing, in the humble, overlooked, endlessly resilient plant growing quietly beneath your own 2 feet.